Welcome back to the Minecraft animation tutorial series using Blender 4.0. This is the fourth chapter of this 5-part series, and if you didn't watch the previous episodes, be sure to check them out here or click the link in the description. If you watched those parts already, well done, and let's continue. In this part, we're going to be jumping into the animation aspect of Blender. So, what we're going to do is, I want my character to swing his sword first on the right side, then on the left side. Then I want him to step forward, step back, and then place his sword over his shoulder, basically. So we're going to do that. But before that, we're going to learn the basics of animation because we cannot jump right into the character animation without learning the basic keyframing. So now that I have all of the collections set up here and organized, what I can do is I can left click, create a new collection, and I'm going to name this, double click and name this animation practice. And I want to show you the basics of animation without using any of the world here. So click on this and then drag down to make every collection disappear so that I don't have anything left over here. And what I can do is basically I can control Shift C and then I can move my cursor to the origin, to the world origin, which is the center over here. So first let's create a cube. If you remember, the way we create new objects is if you click on Shift A, mesh, I can go and click on any mesh. Let's choose cube. And now I'm going to show you the basics of animation. First, we're going to be spending a lot of time on this timeline while creating animations. So let's go through this. So right here in the first part, if you remember, I showed you to set your starting keyframe to 0 and set this to 0 as well. So we have 0 and 250. And if you go back to audio output properties, we have 30 FPS and we have the same settings we have here. So what this means is our animation starts at frame 0 and ends at frame 250. If we have 30 FPS, this means that when I play my timeline, it's going to take 1 second for the cursor to come here. So 1 second to go to frame 30 and 2 seconds to go to frame 60 and so on, because we have 30 frames per second. Now, if you're bad at math like me and you don't want to calculate all the frames and stuff, what you can do for that is basically go to View. And then right here, you can check this show seconds. And then right here, you're going to be able to see seconds instead of frames. So right here, you can see that our animation lasts total of 8.10 seconds, which is basically 250 frames. And over here, you can just click on these seconds. But for now, I prefer to keep it over at frames. Understanding 30 FPS is pretty easy. And by the way, you can zoom in and out on the timeline using your scroll wheel. And you can move the timeline using the middle mouse drag button. Now let's learn how to move our cube and how to keyframe our cube. We already know how to move and rotate the cube. We use G, R, and S. But let's learn the keyframing. So what are keyframes? If you're new to animations, basically keyframes are like markers, which are telling the program where the object is at what point. So let's explain this by actually doing it. So first let's click on F so that I can orbit around my cube properly. Then, if I want to move my cube from this side to this side and then animate it, what I can do is, let's Control Z. I can press on I and this huge menu will pop up. So what I can do is, if I click on location, this means that I told the Blender to set a keyframe for the cube on this location. So once I set a keyframe, you notice that I have this diamond shape over here. And these are called keyframes. And then we're going to need to know how to move and how to set the keyframes properly in order to be able to animate. Well, right now we set a keyframe on frame 0 for location. Now, if I want my cube to move from left to right in 1 second, then this means I'm going to go to frame 30. So the way you move on timeline is you can drag this 3D cursor over this black line. So if I drag my cursor over here, I can move around. So left click and drag your cursor over at frame 30. Then click on this, or you can use GX and then move your cube over here. Left click to release. And now what I can do is click on I and set a location keyframe again. And now we've just did the basic animation and we've animated the cube. So if I go back to frame 0 and I use the play button, or the shortcut is spacebar. So if I press spacebar and then play back, you can see that my cube moves from left to right. Now I can continue doing this. So right here, we already have a keyframe for location. If I go to frame 60, so on 2 seconds, and I move my cube up, I can do this, or I can do GZ. And then I can press on I and then set another keyframe for location. Now if I play back my animation, I have this movement. The cube goes forward and then the cube goes up. Now the same goes for the rotation. If I want to change the rotation, I'm going to press on I and set a keyframe for rotation instead of location. So set a keyframe here, go to frame 30. And then what you can do is press R and then, for example, Y to rotate around the Y axis. And maybe I want to change the rotation this way. I can press on I again and change this to rotation. Now if I go back, my cube is going to move and rotate at the same time. As you can see, we get this animation. And you can do the same for scale. So I, scale, move to frame 30, scale this up, I, scale. And then our cube gets bigger as the animation goes on. If I go to the last frame, what I can do is basically click on Alt S, Alt R, Alt G, and I can press on I and then set a keyframe for location, rotation, and scale, all at the same time. And if I go back, as you can see, my cube moves forward. And since we did the Alt G, since we reset the position, the rotation, and the scale as well, and then we set a keyframe for that, our cube returns to its original position. Now, I want to quickly talk about the keyframe interpolation. So, let's Control Z multiple times until we have only our cube sliding around. So right here, we have our cube sliding from left to right. And as you can see, if you look closely, the cube starts slow, then it speeds up, and then it slows down again. So let's look at it again. Ease in, speed up, and then ease out. For example, if you're coming from After Effects, these keyframes are called Easy Ease, but in Blender, these keyframes are called Bezier. So we have three main interpolations in Blender. We have linear, Bezier, and constant. So on default, we should have this at Bezier. So if we come here, if we select all the keyframes, and you can hover over your timeline and press A to select all the keyframes. If I press on T, we can see that we have these keyframe interpolations. We have Bezier, linear, and constant. By the default, the cube should be left at Bezier, which means that it has a more natural movement. For the human movements, for the character movements, you want to keep them at Bezier. And this is the Bezier movement. But if I set this to, so if I click on T and I set this to linear, you can see the movement is more constant, more robotic. It moves on the same level. So these are two animations on the screen you see here. And then basically they are moving at the same time. They are having the same frame amounts, but they have different keyframe interpolations. As you can see, linear looks a lot like robotic and Bezier looks more natural, more human, and both have their purposes and both have their use cases and use times. But let's talk about how to animate faster. So moving your object, clicking I, setting a keyframe is time consuming, don't you agree? So what we can do instead is, if we go to keying, and click here, I can basically choose, for example, location and rotation. For Minecraft animations, we're not going to be changing the scale of the objects too often. So let's choose location and rotation. And if I go forward to frame 60 and I press on I, the menu doesn't appear anymore. It automatically sets the keyframe for me. So if I move my object up and then press on I again to set a keyframe, I can go back, play this, and then you can see the object moves up. Now another quick thing we can do is press on this button, and that's called auto keyframing. So once we move our object to a different place on frame 90, for example, GX, for example, I want to move it forward. Now you can see I don't have to press I anymore. The keyframe is set automatically. Now let's go forward and show you another example. If I move this back, the keyframe is set automatically. So while you're animating, it's ideal to go to keying, change this to location rotation, and then turn this auto keyframing so that you don't have to press I. Now if I go forward, change the location of my cube, change the rotation, my cube is going to change everything but without me telling the Blender to which keyframe to set. So go forward, and then you can see we have this cube animation. So before we start animating Steve, be sure to have location and rotation enabled, and you have auto keyframing enabled as well. Now, another thing I want to show you is how to manually change the keyframe interpolation. So as you saw, we can click on T and we can change this to linear or Bezier, and that's useful as well. But there are also manual ways to adjust the keyframes. Also, if I click on constant, you might be curious what this is. So if I click on constant, it's basically this. It's going to jump straight into the next position. And this is used for blocking, if you want to block out your scene. Now, if I want to change the keyframe interpolation manually, I'm going to have to go into animation and use graph editor. But before we do that, let's delete all the keyframes and let's click on Shift A, mesh, and then plane. Let's turn off auto keyframing for now because I don't want to keyframe the plane. So click on this to turn it off. Now scale up the plane. And then let's move my cube up. So I can press GZ. Move it up. So I'm going to show you an example of the cube falling down and bouncing up. So let's animate that. Let's turn on auto keyframing, then press on I to set a starting keyframe for the cube. And then let's move to frame 30. Let's say our cube is falling for like 1 second. Press on GZ, move it down until it touches the plane. So like somewhere over here. Now go forward to like frame 40. And then move this up. And then go to frame 50 and move this down again. Now let's watch our animation back. The cube falls down and bounces up. Now as you can see, the bouncing up part doesn't look realistic, because once some object hits the ground, it bounces up straight away. And our cube is basically easing in and easing out. So what we can do is, we need to adjust this frame right when it hits the ground and bounces up. So we can adjust this frame manually. So what we can do is, go to animation, and then this is the dope sheet where we have all of our keyframe information. And in the timeline, we have our keyframe information as well, but we have way more information here. If I click on this, I have all the information about location, rotation, and scale. So in this case, I don't need the scale values, so I can, for example, drag my mouse. So what I can do is left click and then drag my mouse, which is going to do box selection. And I can press on X and delete. So I just deleted the scale values because I don't need to have them in my animation. So let's continue. This is the dope sheet where you can basically change the keyframes, delete the keyframes, and so on. But we need a graph editor for now. So let's click on this button right here and then go to graph editor. And then we have these different curves. And do not freak out because a lot of animators are pretty intimidated by the graph editor, but it's not as hard as it seems, even though it might be complicated at first. So what we can do is extend this menu, and then we have X location and X rotation. If you remember, we changed the Z location because we used GZ to move it up and down. And up and down movements are basically linked to like Z. That's how you can remember that. So we need the Z location value. And if you click on that, you can see we have this blue line. So this line shows the cube movement basically. So since we only need to animate the Z location, we haven't moved our cube on like X or Y location. Then I can click on this eye icon and then hide everything else apart from Z. So hide. So click and then drag down and it's going to hide everything else. So what I can do is, if we remember in the first part, we changed the preferences so that when we click on F in the viewport, we zoom in on an object. We can do the same here. If I click on F, I can go to this full view. Also, if I click on Control and my middle mouse, I can drag this in and out. So make sure you get comfortable with the graph editor. Like you can do this, for example. Like you don't want to go way too high and way too low. I want to see my entire motion over here. And specifically, I want to see frame 30. Here you have frames here, so that's how you can understand on which frame you're on. So drag my cursor to frame 30. And as you can see, this line is pretty like easing in and easing out. This is round. We want to have this line to be sharp, because sharper line means when the cube hits the ground, it bounces up straight away. So what we can do is we can manually change these handles. So we can see we have like these two handles over here, which allows us to change the rotation. But first, what we need to do is I want to change this side and then change this side as well. So I can left click select and press R to rotate. But the problem is if I rotate this side, it affects this side as well. If I rotate this side, it affects this side as well. But I want only the side to be affected manually. So what I can do is if I select this handle, left click, and then I press V, I can set this to free. And now if I select this again and I rotate it, as you can see, the side is not getting affected, which is exactly what we want. So I can select this, go to a frame 30. I can select this with left click, move it up until we get this like straight diagonal line. Now do the same for the second handle as well. So select this, R to rotate, move it up until we get a straight diagonal line. And now on frame 30, we have this like sharp line, which means that when cube hits the ground, if you watch it closely, it's going to bounce straight up, which is more realistic. There we go. As you can see, it looks more realistic. It hits the ground, it bounces straight up. So the reason why I showed you this is because it's important to know the graph editor basics, and you can adjust the keyframes manually. Mostly you can get away with pressing T and set it to linear or Bezier, but there are some cases where you might to manually adjust the keyframe. So as you can see, we adjusted this. So this is the before and this is the after. Now that we know the basics of animation and the basics of keyframing and keyframe interpolation, we can hide our animation practice. Let's minimize this and hide this, and then enable everything else. So left click and then drag your mouse down, and then I can bring out the entire world. Now, if you're lost in your world, what you can do is basically, since we set up our camera already, I can press on numpad 0, or I can use this camera icon if you don't have a numpad. And if you don't have a numpad, again, but click on this camera icon or click on 0. And now, middle mouse click to exit somewhere over here. So we're back to our original view, and we want to give our Steve some animation. But first thing I'm gonna do is, I don't like these tall grasses. So another thing you can do is a left click on the collection, new collection, and name this something like, I'm gonna name this like extra collection. So if I don't need this grass, like I can move this grass away temporarily or permanently. Like I don't want this grass to be visible at all in my animation. So if I select one grass, you'll notice that it selects like the whole other grass in the entire world. If I select small grass, it does the same. If I select the leaves, it does the same. And if I select the wood, it's basically the same. You get the idea. So I want to select tall grass because I don't think it's necessary in the scene. And I'm going to press on amp, move it in the extra collection. And then I can hide my extra collection. And then it's not going to appear in the final render, it's not going to appear here, and it's not going to get in our way. And if you created a different world and you have something you would like, you can do the same. Like you can get rid of the tall grass, you can get rid of like flowers if you want, but I'm going to keep the flowers for now because they're not getting in the way of my scene. So let's go back to the camera view. So for the very first animation, as I mentioned, I want my character to do some sword swinging animation, then move forward and move backwards, and then put the sword over the shoulder. So let's begin making our animation. Let's go out of our camera view because we don't need it for now. But while you're animating, I recommend to do this. So if you remember, if we go up here and then we right click, we have the option to do vertical split. So let's do vertical split and then left click to apply. Now you can go inside the camera view here. So press 0, zoom in, and then get rid of this panel. So click on T and then click on N as well to get rid of this panel if you have it enabled. And also, I would recommend to turn off the overlays over here so that you only see the mesh and you see like things that are close to being like rendered. Also, if you want to animate right now, you can minimize these because you don't need to use these for now. And then you can move the screen over here, maybe scroll out a little bit. And basically, the idea of splitting the screens like this is you're going to be in the 3D view here, and any changes you're going to make are going to appear here. And you're going to see the changes and how they're going to look in the final render over here. So this is very useful to check like two views at the same time. So we're going to be animating here, And then we're going to see how it's going to look from the camera's perspective and in the final render. So let's begin our animation. So if you remember, if I left click select my character and I go into pose mode by clicking Ctrl Tab, I go inside the pose mode. First of all, always go to frame 0 because you might start animating from the middle and you're going to have to change the keyframe and move the keyframes back, which is unnecessary. So let's go to 0, frame 0, drag my cursor over here, left click to drag my cursor, and then go to frame 0. Now what I would recommend is before you start any animation, you want to set a starting keyframe for everything, like for your character, for your object. Press A to select your whole character. If you press A, it's going to select every bone in your character. So press A and then press I. And since we changed keying to location rotation and we enabled auto keyframing, it's going to set the keyframe for my whole character's mesh. It's going to set location and rotation for the arms, the hands, the body, and everything else. And also, for now, go out of the pose mode, Ctrl Tab, select your sword, and set a keyframe for your sword as well. So press I. Now, when you're creating animations, first thing you're going to do is get the basic movements done. You don't have to make a perfect animation. First, get the basic movements done, and then add the in-between movements, and then polish your animation. If you want to find out more information about that, you can check out my video, which is going to appear here, or you can click the link in the description as well. But for now, we're going to do the basic movements, then we're going to add some in-between movements, and then we're going to polish our animation. So let's create the basic movements. So go to Ctrl Tab and click on pose mode. And let's select my R. So my hand is going to be the main focus point here because my character is going to swing his sword from left to right and from right to left, basically. So while animating, you're going to be noticing that I'm often using the RR method. So feel free to use RR method as well, or you can manually follow like RX, RY. Just use the settings whichever you want. Just use the settings and use the methods which are more comfortable for you. So let's start our animation. First thing I want to do is maybe I want to have my hand up like this. I want to have this hand a bit forward. And I'm going to select this leg, click on G and then Y to move it back, and do the same for this leg. GY and move it forward. Move the body down, so GZ. Actually, if you want to follow along better, I'm going to use these gizmos so that it's not going to be more confusing for you. So move this down, rotate this, rotate the body, rotate the hips as well, pelvis and torso, and then move my hand. Basically, I'm trying to get a good starting position, which is going to set up my animation. So for the basic animation, this should be enough. And I'm not going to go too much into the facial expressions, but let's give him an angry look since he's like training and swinging his sword. So maybe give him like a bit of angry look here and then here. Rotate this and then rotating this as well a bit. Now what I want to do is select my hand. And what I want to do is basically go to frame 20. And then I can use RR to move my hand down, to move my character's hand down like this. And another trick you can do is you can also move the shoulders. So if I press on G, like if I do this too much, obviously we don't want this. But if I press on G and move the hand slightly, then I can move my character's hand forward. I can also do the same for the arm. And since our character swung his sword from one side to another, I need to animate the body as well. So RZ to rotate the body, RZ here, and then RZ here as well. I can left click and select the head and move it forward. What I can do as well is I can animate the legs, but I'm going to do that later in the polishing stage. We're just trying to get the basic movements done here. So we have one swinging motion. Character swings his sword like this. Now, since it was from here to here, now I want to do this on the opposite direction. So let's go to frame 40. And before you move on to the animation, before you move on to frame 40, make sure you have keyframes set for all the important bones you want to animate. So I can manually select my arm, my hand, my whole body, select the arm and hand on the second side, select the head, and select both legs. These are all the main keyframes you want to be animating. So press on I, so that make sure that every keyframe is set before you move on to the next frame. So now I'll move on to the next frame, which is frame 40. And then I can use R to rotate my arm this way, so up. And I can grab my arm and move it back, but what I can do is also press Alt-G. So if I press on Alt-G, it's gonna go into starting position, and I can move my shoulder in the starting position. Now, I can do the same for the body. If I press on Alt-R here, Alt-R, Alt-R, it's gonna set into the starting position. But I can also press R-Z and move it slightly on this side. And head always stays on the target. So basically RZ, and then you want to keep the head like in the center. And let's see how it looks. Our character swings the sword here, and then here. And on the final frame, on frame 40, I can move the hand forward as well. Now what I want my character to do, as you can see on the screen here, basically after the character swings the sword from one side to another, the character after this is going to step forward, and then is going to move the sword forward. So on frame 40, again, make sure you select all the bones. So I can select the bone and then shift select other bones as well. I can press on I to set a keyframe for all of them. And now go to frame 60. And now I want to move my character forward. I want to make my character take a step forward. So first, let's go to the body and press on Alt-R so that the body is facing forward. Do the same for the head, Alt-R. And now what I can do is do the same here as well, Alt-R and Alt-R. Now take the body over here and then move this forward. You can use these arrows if you want. So move it forward and then move it slightly down. Now do the same for the leg. Since we set a keyframe for all of these here on frame 40, they should be able to move. So let's move them forward. Click here and move it forward, or use GY. So move them forward. And if I play back my animation, I can see that my character stands here and then he takes a step forward right here. So let's play back our animation. This is like the basic movements. Swing, swing, and then move forward. That's good. Now, when the character moves forward, he's going to try to basically stab someone with a sword during the training. So what we want to do is move this hand forward. So it's going to be facing like straight to the camera. So rotate it and then move this forward. And I can press on G and then move the shoulder a bit forward as well. Not too much. And then once the character basically stops, he's going to want to move his arm back. And what we can do is also we can rotate the body forward, R and then R, and then do the same here. And then head always focuses on target, so I can press on RX and then move it up. Or I can just re-rotate the head. So right here, I want my sword to be facing forward. So what I can do is go to frame 40, go out of the pose mode of the character, and then select the sword and then set a keyframe. So press I anywhere here. Now go to frame 60, and then what I can do is rotate the sword. So if I press on R and then Z, I'm going to rotate my sword on a Z axis, and if I press on G, I can move it in the character's R, somewhere over here. And as you can see, we have our sword here. And if I play back my animation, you can see we have this motion. First, the character has sword on the side, and now the sword is facing forward, as if Steve is trying to like stab someone. And after this movement, we want to go back to the previous pose, and we want Steve to basically add his sword on his shoulder like a cool anime character. So what I can do is go back to pose mode. So press on Control Tab, and then again, remember to set a keyframe for everything before you move on to the next frame. So select both legs. So I'm basically shift selecting the bones. Shift right, left click, shift left click, and then select everything. and then press on I, and then go to frame 80. And then again, if I want to take a step back, I'm going to take the body and then move it back. Move it up slightly, and then do the same for the leg. If I move my leg back, and I can press on the body as well, and then do Alt-R, Alt-R, Alt-R. Do the same here, Alt-R, and then Alt-R over here. But I can move my hand slightly on the side, and I want my character to have his hand like this. So it's going to be up here. And then I can, if I want to move my shoulder back again, I can press on Alt-G. It's going to reset the location. Then I can rotate this over here. Maybe rotate this back. And then I can go out of the pose mode because I cannot select the sword. Again, if you want to select objects inside pose mode, then you can click on Edit and disable Lock Object Mode, and you will be able to select objects here. But I don't want to do that because it gets in the way of my animating process. So I'm going to enable this again, and I'm going to go out of the pose mode, select the sword, and then rotate it like this, for example, so that it sits on his shoulder. It actually doesn't sit on his shoulder because it's hard to do that with Minecraft characters, but from here it gives the illusion that it basically sits on his like shoulder or the neck, you know, like a cool anime character. So you can play around with this. And now we have our basic movements done. And now it's going to be pretty easy to add like in-between movements because we have all the basic movements done. And then after this, the animation should not be too hard. So if we play back, we have this basic animation. Swing, swing, go forward, and then put the sword back on his shoulder. Now, what do I mean by in-between movements? So right here, we have frame 0 and frame 20. In between movements, this case would be about frame 10. So on frame 10, we want to make the movement which is gonna help our animation to look more realistic. So in this case, if I have my arm swinging from this side to this side, what I can do is go to frame 10, move this slightly up, move this slightly up as well, and do the same for the body. So move this up, and then move this up. And what this is going to do is add an in-between movement, like a small detail. And as you can see, this looks a lot more natural, like the characters moving up and then moving down. If we go to frame 20, and then after the frame 20, if you want to add in between movements, this will be like on frame 30. So obviously, this doesn't look natural, like this doesn't look realistic, like the sword goes through the character, which we don't want. So we can adjust these during in-between keyframes. So go to frame 30 in this case. And what I can do is take my arm and move it forward and then move it downwards. And if I want my character to make this cool sword swinging animation like this, I want my body to be following as well. So go to frame 30 again. Press RX to rotate forward. No, this one. RX. And then RX. So again, we can add in between movements here. And we can add in between for other body parts as well. So we added with the arm and with the body. Or we can add in between with this arm moving slightly. We can move the head down slightly as well. And the general idea is to make the movement more natural. And we can make the swinging a lot cooler as well. We can play around with different bones. So first of all, when the character moves forward, we can make him move up. And then we can make his leg move up as well. So we can move the body and we can move the leg. Also what we can do is maybe he can rotate his body a bit back. We can do the same here. And as you can see, this is already looking better. But another thing we can do is while he's in the middle, so on frame 50, while he's moving up and then he has his leg up, what we can do here is take the arm, move it slightly back, so RZ, and then take this arm and then rotate this like almost all the way in, like this. Like make sure the sword doesn't go into his shoulder because that looks unrealistic. But maybe tilt his body like this. And take his head, RX, and then move it forward. And what this will give us is basically add like an in-between movement, and then the character is doing basically like tucking his sword and then releasing it. So as you can see, this is already looking better, but obviously this is not a finished product. So right here, I don't like the head, for example, so I can move this up because I don't like the way it moves down. So the general idea of in-between movements is basically getting like between the keyframes and adding like extra movement and extra flair to make it more realistic. And you can also fix some of the poses. As you saw, like right here, his sword was moving behind his leg, and then right here it's fixed. It's not the case. Well, it is the case a bit. So what I can do is, if the sword is going forward in his leg, I can just rotate this forward. And now the issue should be fixed. And let's add an in-between movement for the last frame too. So from frame 60 to 80, we have frame 70 in the middle. So go to frame 70. And while the character is moving back, again, we can move his body up. We can move his leg up. Since the character is moving his right leg backwards, I can go to frame 70, press on G, and then move this up. And then RX to rotate it around X-axis. And then we have this cool rotation on the leg. You can move it slightly up as well. Change the rotation maybe. And also we can move the body up. So RX. And basically what I forget to show you is we have rotations based on global and local axes. So if I want to explain this better, I'm going to have to rotate the character over here. So let's pause the animation for a second. Let's rotate the character here. So for example, if I want to rotate my body on X-axis, if I press on RX, it's rotating on the global axis. And the global axis is basically the world axis, which we see in the beginning. Like this is the global axis, and this is the global axis as well. But sometimes I don't want to rotate my body around the global axis. So if I press on RX, it's rotating around the X, which is like the default X axis. But if I press on X again, it's going to rotate on the local axis. So if I press on RXX, it's going to rotate on the local X axis. And same goes for Z, and then Y, and then Y. But since our character in the beginning was facing forward, we're basically using like the world origin most of the time, like the world axis. So hopefully you understood that, and let's continue animating. So right here, I want to move this hand out like this, move this out this way, Control Tab, select the sword, move it this way, and then as you can see, he goes back, steps up, and then slows down. Now we can add even more in between. So right here, we can add in between for all the body parts. So right here, we have keyframes for like hands and body, but we can do this for like pelvis and torso and the head as well. Can make him like move his hand forward and then backwards. And we can animate the arm as well to give some extra detail. We can move the hand outwards. And basically we're now adjusting the in-between keyframes and adding even more in-between keyframes. So right here when he swings, I want him to move like forward, like this, so that it's like an impactful swing. Then maybe rotate his head as well. So let's see. Boom. We have like a slashing animation. Then add in between movements for other body parts as well. Rotate this forward. Basically, we're just adding more in-between movements right now and adjusting some in-between movements. Now I want him to go back. Make his head move forward. Rotate his hand even up. Move this hand forward. So that's like leading the next action. So as you can see, the animation is slowly starting to look better and more realistic. Right here, I want to add more in-between movements to make it like a more impactful swing or stabbing animation. You move the body even up, rotate this, move this back, and then while he's in the middle, I can make his body turn this way. I can move his hand forward. I can even rotate this, move the head forward, and then boom, that's a more impactful swing. And then he's turning this way in the middle, which is like too much, I think. So I can just adjust it this way, adjust it this way, maybe make the leg move like here. And once he swings, in order for it to look more realistic, I can go basically from left to right. So I want my body to go on the right side, so it looks more natural after this. And again, if I do this, I need to rotate my head forward. I need to rotate my arm forward as well. Maybe give it a slight rotation. And then move forward. And this is what we get so far. This is already looking a lot smoother if you compare it to the first initial phase. Add more in between movements here. So here I want maybe the character to step up but bend a little down so that he prepares to place the sword behind him. I can slightly move the head as well, and maybe I can make him look towards the sword. I can move the sword and arm, and keyframe the sword again so that he does this motion. Boom. And on the last action, when a character puts his sword over his shoulder, I don't want him to just stop. So during animations, you want to keep things natural. So when he stands here, I want to continue the movement for a few frames. So I can go to pose mode, and then I can slightly rotate the body after the last frame. Do this, and then look forward, slightly move the hand, and then we get this. Instead of stopping right away, we get this. We get like slow animation after the movement. Like obviously the body rotation is too much, but maybe I can do RX twice and then like this. Okay, we're gonna move his head to make it like more natural like this. Yeah, you get the idea. Now we got the main movements and we got the in-between movements. But the final part of the animation is basically the most time-consuming and for some animators the most annoying, which I agree with, but it's necessary, and it's called polishing. So polishing means basically going through every frame and checking the pose, adjusting the poses, adjusting the timing, making sure everything is right. And sometimes you want to add in-between movements, even in-between movements. So basically if I have an in-between between 0 and 20, which is 10, I can add in-between like 0 and 10, and from 10 to 20 as well. So on frame 5 and frame 15, I can add some extra in-between movements as well. And that animation process, maybe it sounds complicated and it takes time, but once you make a lot of animations, you're gonna get used to it as well. So right now, in order for this video not to drag on too long and not to be too long, I'm gonna time lapse this and I'm gonna come back. And feel free to go through the animation and give it your own twist as well. And we're gonna come back soon with the finished animation. So now that we have our animation polished, let me show you a few more things. First, you notice that when animation stops playing, the timeline still keeps going. And if I want to play back my animation and watch it multiple times, what I can do is basically select all of my character bones. So I'm going to select one bone and then press on A to select everything. And as you can see, my last character frame is at frame 115. The end frame right now is 250. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to left click here on 150, Control C to copy this, go to end, and then type Control V. And then we just type 115 as the end frame. And you notice this basically shrinks down. And if I play back my animation, it's going to play it in a loop without me having to replay it myself. So that's the first thing you can do. And the second thing is, while you're animating, sometimes you might notice that your animation is either too slow or too fast. And you want to scale up your keyframes or scale them down. You don't want to do everything manually. So you don't want to take this keyframe and then move it forward or backwards. Let me show you a faster way to speed up or slow down your animation. When you're working in Blender, also you want to frequently save your file. So I recommend to get used to clicking Ctrl S every few minutes or so. And let's go into the animation tab right now. So we're going to click on animation. So this is the animation tab. And what you can do is right here, you want to change this to dopesheet. So click on this button, then come down here and then click on dopesheet. Now, as you can see, the dopesheet is pretty small, and what we need to do is we can get rid of this panel, which we don't need. So you can press on N, and that will get rid of this panel. And right here, we have this default 3D view. So what we can do is press on 0, numpad 0 to go inside the camera view. And then also we're in a solid mode. So if I click on this arrow, I can do the same thing I did previously. So click on texture, then disable outline and disable specular lighting as well. And I can turn off the overlays as well, but for now I'm going to keep them on. So basically here we have all of our keyframes. Dopesheet shows all of our keyframes. It shows everything that is animated, like if you animate one character, 2 characters, if you animate camera, it shows everything. But if I click on this arrow, I'm only going to see the keyframes which I am selecting. So if I select my character's body, for example, I left click, it's only going to show me the bones for pelvis. If I select the head, it's going to show me the keyframes for the head. If I select everything, it's going to show me every keyframe. So right now, I think the animation is normal. It's not too fast and not too slow. But let's say I thought it was too fast. What I can do is basically select every bone in my character's body. Then right here, these white dots, that they're basically the keyframes. They're basically the same diamonds we had in the timeline. So I can press on A to select every keyframe and make sure my timeline cursor is at 0. And what I can do is I can basically scale the keyframe. So if you remember, we press S for scale. So if you press S, you can scale out your keyframes. And this means that your animation is slowing down. The more you scale out your keyframes, the more the animation will slow down. So if I play back right now, the animation is a lot slower. And you notice that the sword is not following the character's movements because we need to slow down the sword movement as well. So let's Ctrl Z and then let's also select the sword as well. So what we can do right now is click on Edit, uncheck this Lock Object Mode, and then Shift select the sword as well. And now again, go back, again press on A to select everything, and then scale out your keyframes. And then you'll notice that the animation will slow down a lot. And the sword is following the movement as well. And I'm going to Ctrl Z now. And another way you can scale out your animations, if you want to be precise, you can press on S and then you can type a value. For example, I can press on S and type 1.5. And as you can see, all of my keyframes extended by 1.5 value. So if I play back again, my animation gets slower. Now, if I think my animation is too slow, I can also speed it up. So what I can do is, instead of scaling out, I can scale them in. So if I scale my keyframes in, you'll notice that the animation becomes a lot faster. And again, if I Ctrl Z, and if I press on S and type something like 0.8, you can see that my keyframes scaled down. And that's another way to scale down your keyframes as well. But for this animation, I like the previous version before we did any changes in the dope sheet. So what I can do is I'm going to Ctrl Z. And yeah, we can keep this moving. But if you want, you can scale up your keyframes, scale down your keyframes, and you can change to any speed you prefer. And the last thing I want to show you is the camera animation. Right now, our camera is static. It's not really moving. And what I want to do is I want to have a camera cut on one of the keyframes, like when he stands here, for example. And then I also want to add a quick winking animation. It's pretty easy, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Once he stands like this on frame 90, we can click on Control Tab and set a keyframe for one of the eyes. So the way you can move the eyes is either by using this button, which will allow you to move the pupils. This will allow you to extend both eyes. This does the same thing from the bottom. But if you left click on one of the eyes, you can move individual eyes. I can left click select the eye and then press on eye to set a keyframe for it on frame 90 or frame 92. Let's go to frame 90 and set a keyframe for eye. Now, if I go forward about 5 frames, so on frame 95, what I can do is I can use these arrows to basically shrink down the eye as if the character blinked. And then I can go forward, then bring out the eye again on the starting position. I can basically extend this up. I can use GZ, or I can just use Alt G. And that's going to place the eye in the starting position. So if you play back our animation, you can see that Steve is winking, and we have this cool winking animation. But obviously this is not enough. We want the eyebrow to move as well. We want the head to bob as well, so that it looks more natural. So we can set a keyframe for this. Like, this controls the rotation of the eyebrow, but this outside bone controls the entire eyebrow. So I can set a keyframe here, go forward on frame 95, move this down, go to frame 100, and click on Alt G to move it on a starting position. And also, if you notice, on frame 95, when the eyes move down, we have some flickering, but it's not really noticeable in the material view, so that shouldn't be a problem in the final render. But if you want to be precise, you can rotate this and then match it to this line so that it's not like flickering and it's not causing any issues. And we can do this. Now if I play back, you can see Steve is winking, the eyebrow is also moving. I think the eyebrow is moving too much, so I'm going to move it up in the frame 95, or where it comes down. Also, when Steve winks, I want my head to bob slightly as well, so that it looks more natural. So again, go to frame 90, click I to set a keyframe, go to frame 95, and then I can click on RX, X again, and then move it down, and then move it on the side. And then go to frame 100, and again, RXX to move it up and rotate it. As you can see, we have this small winking animation. But he looks too serious right now, so what we can do is, when he wakes, we can animate the mouth. So let's set a keyframe for this mouth position controller, I, and let's set a keyframe here as well. So let me show you what this does. If I go to frame 105, for example, I can extend the mouth, and what I can do is, if I rotate this is going to control the expressions of the mouth. So if I rotate this on the left side, we can get the happy Steve, but obviously that's like way too much, that looks like a meme. And if I rotate this down, so on the right side, we can see that Steve's expression becomes like more sad. But we need Steve to be like smiling, so we can do this, then we can open his mouth, and then we can do this. So if I play back, you can see that Steve is smiling and opening his mouth. And in the last section, in the last frame, I don't want his mouth to move all the way down. I kind of want to keep the same keyframes, so I'm going to rotate this and then extend this again. But what I can do is basically, I can click on this keyframe, and if I want to have the same keyframe here, so if I want to copy paste my keyframes, there are two ways. One is I can go here, left click to select the keyframe, Control C, and then click on Control V. Now we have the same keyframes. And I can also left click select, and I can click on Shift D. So Shift D in Blender is basically copying. You can copy the keyframes, you can copy the objects, and so on. So I just copy this keyframe, and I want to change it slightly in the last frame. I want to make him smile even more, like this. And if we play back our animation, we have this like short winking animation with our Steve smiling. This isn't bad for like first animation. You can play around a lot more, you can do more changes if you want to, but for now I think I'm going to keep it this way. And also let's animate the camera so that it's like more cinematic and looks much cooler. So go back to the solid view because everything turns dark. But the way you animate the camera is basically you set a keyframe. So first you're going to select the camera, you're going to left click, and then you basically do the same thing you did for the character. You go on certain frame, you press that frame, and you press I, and then you can move the camera. So there are two ways I can animate the camera. One is I can just use Shift F and then move with WASD. Or since I have two views and I want to be precise, I can go out of the camera view and I can just use these arrows, and then it will show me what it's doing basically here. But let's use the Shift F method. So I'm gonna go inside the camera view and then go to frame 0 and choose a good starting position. So you can play around with the camera and place it wherever you want. I'm gonna click on Shift F, Q and E and try to adjust the camera. And also what I can do is I'm gonna click on this auto keyframing because I want to change the environment and I don't want it to be keyframed. So turn off auto keyframing and click on grass. And I think that the grass is way too tall and it's a bit distracting. So I can press on G, Z, and I can use my arrows on my keyboard. So basically we have up and down and sideways arrows. So I can click on my down arrow multiple times. I can press and hold it as well. And I can move my grass down. And I want to move my grass down so that it's not distracting and it's still decorating the environment. So let's go down somewhere over here and I think this should be enough. So once you're happy with your position, so G, Z and move the arrows, you can press on enter to confirm the movement, or you can left click as well. And now we have just moved our grasses down and we have more space and Steve's movements are more visible. So I think I like this position of the camera. When Steve swings twice and then moves forward, I can move the camera forward. So until frame 70, like until he moves back, I want my camera to be moving forward. So I'm gonna press. So first thing I did is I went to frame 0 and clicked on I to set a starting keyframe from the camera. Now go to frame 70 and then click on Shift S and click on W and then use your mouse to rotate the camera. So if I click on W, I can slightly move my camera in. And again, I forgot to turn on the auto keyframing. So click on that and then click on I. In this case, auto keyframing didn't set a keyframe because I didn't turn it on. But if I press on I, my keyframe will be set. So if I play back my animation, as you can see, my camera is moving forward with Steve. And what I want to do is after frame 70, I want to add a camera cut and I want a kind of close-up shot of Steve's face so that we see him winking. So on frame 70, make sure you have set your keyframe. So press on I again. And then you can use your arrows. You can use your left or right arrows. So right arrow goes forward with the keyframes and left arrow goes back to the keyframes. Also, if you use your up and down arrows, you can jump between the last keyframe. So if I use my down arrow, I can go to frame 0. If I use my up arrow, I can go on frame 70. So down and up basically jumps between the last keyframes. Now I want to go forward only one frame. So I can use my right arrow on my keyboard. And then what I want to do is click on Shift F, move my camera closer to Steve, and place it somewhere over here. And then let's see. And then once he goes back, I want my camera to follow Steve's movement. So first I'm going to adjust the position because I don't really like it. Like on the camera cut, I want the sword to be visible as well. And when Steve goes back, I can basically go to like frame 85 until he stops. I can follow his movement. So I can move my camera even further. As you can see, if I play back my animation, I have this camera cut. So Steve swings the sword and then there's a camera cut before he stops moving. And what I can do is also to improve my animation. First thing obviously is I want to add a slight movement to the camera as well on the last keyframe. So again, Shift F, I just moved it forward slightly and then it sets keyframe automatically if you have this turned on. And also what I want to do is once he goes up, before he basically puts the sword behind his head, I can follow the sword's movement. So I can click on Shift F and then rotate this. And then let's see. Yeah, I think that's a bit too much. I can click on this keyframe, move this to frame 90 and click on this keyframe, move this to frame 80. And I basically slowed down the animation a little bit. And also I wouldn't want this to move all the way up. So I can click on Shift F and then turn this down like this. And let's see. And now the animation looks a lot better. Now we use the Shift F method to move the camera, or you can use these arrows to move the camera as well. But another method, which a lot of beginners find easier, is if you press on N on your keyboard, let's bring out the side panel. If I click on View, I have this lock option here, and I can lock camera to view. If I extend this, this menu says lock camera to view. So if I check this and I turn off this view, I can move my camera just the way I'm moving around in the viewport. So if I use my scroll wheel, if I hold on my scroll wheel and rotate, you can see that my camera is rotating. If I use shift and middle mouse, I can pan around with the camera. So you can use this method as well if you find this shift F method to be tedious. But I'm using the shift F method, and you can use any method you want. But don't forget to turn this camera option off if you want to go out of the camera view. So for example, you can go out of the camera view using numpad 0, but my habit is I'm clicking the scroll wheel to go out of the camera view. And once I'm clicking the scroll wheel, you can see I'm not going out of the camera view because it's moving because I have this turned on. So if you don't want to use it, just turn this off. But if you want to use it, it's there. So you click on N and click lock camera to view. Right now, I'm going to turn this off. Let's Control Z, and I'm just going to polish this animation for now. So in the first frame, I want my camera to be moving more. So it's moving from here to here. But I want the movement to be more noticeable. So what I can do is I can click on Shift F and then press S to make my camera go even further back. So if I play back, the movement is going to be more noticeable. But also what you notice is camera eases in, speeds up, and eases out. And that's basically the Bezier keyframe. But right here on the first shot before the camera cut, I want the movement to be linear. I want my camera to move on the same level. And after this, I want to keep the Bezier movement. So I can select the first keyframe, click on T, and then select linear. And now you can see the camera position changed. And now the movement is going to be more constant. And after this, the movement is going to be Bezier, which works for this case. You can also play around more with facial expressions, with body movements, with the camera positioning. Now what we can do also is, for example, I want the first scene to be wide. So I can go here, and then if you remember, we can adjust the focal length. So let's make this wider by turning down the focal length. And after the camera cut, I want the focal length to be smaller because it's more close up to the character. So on frame 70, what I can do is I can go inside the camera properties and then go to focal length. I can right click and set a keyframe. And as you can see, it turns yellow. But what I can do is also, I'm going to Control Z. I can hover over this and then I press on I, and that also sets the keyframe. Now if I go to frame 70, and right now we have this green instead of like yellow or white. So if I left click and type something like 50, I get a close-up shot, and we animated the focal length as well. So we have a camera cut, and we also animated the focal length. So we have this animation right now. We have a wide shot, and we have a close-up shot. Now there are other ways to move your keyframes in the dope sheet as well. And previously I showed you, you can press on A and select every keyframe. But for now, when I'm watching my animation, I realized that it's too slow. So what I can do is, after the camera cut, I can keep this animation as it is. But before the camera cut, I think the animation and the sword swinging is way too slow. So what I can do basically is, we have this summary over here. And if I drag my mouse, so if I box select, like I can click on B, or even without B, I can just left click and drag my mouse, and I can select the keyframes. And if I select all of these keyframes, all of my keyframes below will be selected automatically. So all of my bone keyframes and my sword keyframes and my camera keyframes will be selected. So remember to turn off this arrow if you want to select every keyframe. So I want to go here before the camera cut, which is the frame 70. So I'm going to select all my keyframes by using box select. So let's box select all of these keyframes. So if I left click and drag, like left click somewhere outside, or if you want, you can use the B as well. So go to frame 70, then drag your mouse, and then select every frame until 70. Now we have selected every keyframe until the camera cut, basically. So I can press on S.8, and now you can see the animation looks a lot faster. And it makes sense because it's like a fighting move. So now our last keyframe before the camera cut is 56. And if we move, we see that we have no camera cut. We have this like slow Tarantino zoom, basically. You can keep that if you want because it's kind of cool. But what I want to do is go after frame 57 and deselect all the keyframes. And if I want to select every keyframe that's on the right side of my cursor, I cannot do that by pressing A. What I have to do instead is I can press on Control and then left click somewhere over here. So Control left click, select all the keyframes that are on the right side of my cursor. And I can do the opposite here. So if I Control left click on this side, it selects every keyframe before the cursor. So this time I want to select every keyframe outside of my cursor. So I'm going to do Control left click. And then I'm going to press on G to move my keyframes. So I use S to scale them up and scale them down, but I'm going to use G to move them here. So basically I want to move them on frame 57. So after frame 56, here I want to have a camera. So press on G, move your keyframes here. This is the first keyframe, you can tell it by that. So move my keyframes over here. And then if I play back my animation, you can see that I still have my camera. I have a faster animation in the beginning and I still have a camera. And if I go back to the layout, and if I go Control Tab and select all my characters' bones, you'll notice that my last keyframe is not 115, but this time it's 101. So I can type 101 or I can just copy and paste this. So left click, Control C, Control V, and then I can loop and play back my animation again. So here we are with our finished animation. And even though it's a short animation, it's a pretty good practice for like getting started, getting things right, understanding keyframing, timing, in between movements and polishing. And you can give your animation your own twist. You can follow along, you can do whatever you want. You can repeat this and do this again, or you can start with a new animation. Just do whatever you want. The main thing is to practice. You can practice with moving around the cube, and you can practice with moving around the character as well. And also, if you don't understand anything about the animation, then don't worry, don't beat yourself up, because 3D is not easy to begin. It's very hard in the beginning, especially the animation and especially the character animation. So it's fine. If you don't understand something, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment. I can answer you, or other people can answer you as well. If you want to support the channel and also get cool rewards, then be sure to check out my page, which will be linked in the description. Now click here to watch part 5, which will be the final part of this series. So click here or click the link in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.